Hello everyone and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name as always is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this Monday afternoon. We have a great show ahead, a lot of sports news to cover. Maybe not going to get to as much of it as you would like, but still nonetheless going to be a fantastic show here on the podcast to open up the week. Starting off by looking at some off-season guides for some NFL playoff teams that were eliminated in the past. We're getting into Super Bowl week, so why not talk about some teams that are still trying to get over that hump, unlike the Chiefs and the Eagles. Starting off with talking about two AFC playoff participants in the Bills and the Ravens. Then we're looking at the best players offensively in both conferences, the all AFC playoff offense and then the all NFC playoff offense we will look at. And then to conclude, we talk with the Bucks Thunder, not potentially the basketball news you would like to hear, but still very interesting game taking place tonight, and also kind of ties in to the interesting basketball news, the groundbreaking basketball news, some would say, that happened over this weekend. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you all to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you haven't done so already and you feel so inclined to keep up to date with all of our new content as it's released. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, the best way to get your opinions, feedback, and input out there on air. You can go to our website, gsmcpodcast.net, and do the exact same thing. Likewise, tips and donations are genuinely appreciated as well, and it just makes our shows that much better when you, our faithful audience, are interacting with them as well. But without further ado, let's jump right into the first segment of today's show, talking about the off-season guide for the Buffalo Bills. And now that postseason heartbreak has yet again happened to them, what do they do this offseason to ensure they have another chance to get over the hump, potentially at home? Because that's been one of the big problems, right? They always have to go down to Arrowhead to beat the Chiefs, and even at home in recent years, they haven't fared well against this Kansas City Chiefs team. But that's not the only reason as to why this Buffalo Bills team seemingly cannot get over the hump. I feel like they are an elite football team. It's just that they don't necessarily have the players to bolster that argument. They are more than the sum of their parts, but now it's time for them to buy into the superstar identity. I feel like, yes, even though the season was fantastic for Josh Allen, for this offense, and potentially for some members of this defense, I still feel like you need a big signing, whether it be on the offensive or defensive side of the football, or even a stellar draft to really bolster the identity of this team. Because right now, that's why I feel like the Bills are still lagging behind the Kansas City Chiefs in terms of Super Bowl appearances. I feel like even though Stephon Diggs was seen as the distraction a couple years ago and the reason why he might have ultimately left, I still think that the Buffalo Bills need someone in a groundbreaking manner to really bolster this team. And while they did pick up Amari Cooper mid-season, I don't necessarily think that one of the big off-season priorities of re-signing him will necessarily happen. So, with that being said, let's recap yet again the Bills season and then get into some of the off-season topics that they need to address in order to bolster this team and better prepare for getting over the hump against Kansas City and the rest of the loaded and stacked AFC. But overall, starting off with how they play in the regular season, fascinating regular season, much improved offensively under Joe Brady, really limited Josh Allen's turnovers, really allowed James Cook to become a focal point in this offense, and this wide receiver core that was much maligned entering the season, really not having a true number one wide receiver, really stepped up. I liked how Khalil Shakir played, Dalton Kincaid in his second year, kind of did regress to the mean a little bit, but not necessarily so much as to say he's not going to still continue to be a superstar tight end because he had an incredible season. Keon Coleman had a decent rookie season as well, especially in terms of being a big physical red zone target for Josh Allen. But ultimately, they did not get over the hump yet again in the championship round, falling to, of course, Kansas City on the road at Arrowhead. And for that to not be the story anymore, they're going to have to address a lot of things. You would think that an AFC championship runner-up would not necessarily have that many problems, but it's the Buffalo Bills, and this is more than an AFC championship appearance. It's getting past Patrick Mahomes and his group year in, year out. And in order to do that, I simply don't think that this current iteration of the Buffalo Bills is ready. So they're going to have to make a lot of shrewd additions to this team, potentially through the draft, because I don't necessarily know if they'll do that much in free agency to really bolster the squad and get it to where I want to be. Now, I think the biggest offseason priority to address is obviously this defense, because there are going to be a lot of questions specifically about some free agents in this offseason that will have to be addressed immediately by Buffalo. First of all, Buffalo couldn't move on from Von Miller after the season, and I think that it would be apt of them to do so because I don't necessarily think he's going to be a vocal leader for this group for that much more time, so it's good to cut ties with him. Potentially losing Rasul Douglas is quite another, because you really rely on, if you're the Buffalo Bills, that secondary. That secondary plays with the best zone coverage in the entire NFL, and while they're not necessarily the most well-known secondary, they're not the biggest secondary, they do play zone coverage to a T, and losing a guy like Rasul Douglas, who really was phenomenal this season for them, could be a bummer. But I do think that in order to really diversify this defense, you need to build up that front seven. And moving on from Von Miller and potentially finding a younger option, whether it be through the draft and free agency, could be apt for the Buffalo Bills this offseason. But ultimately, cornerback could be a shocking position of need after another great year for this secondary. And then a smaller thing to note in terms of priorities in the offseason is the special teams. Tyler Bass really struggled this year, only made 82.8% of his field goal tries this season. And while, kicking woes weren't necessarily a problem ultimately for Buffalo, they weren't called into question, it's still something of note because Tyler Bass is ultimately famous for last year in the divisional round missing that field goal that would have tied up that game against Kansas City. So that's something that could go into the minds of a lot of Bills fans this offseason. Will they potentially get more special teams help, find a replacement kicker? Ultimately, I do think that defense is paramount to the success of Buffalo next season, and addressing that side of the football is going to be key to how they'll bolster their chances of beating Kansas City again come next postseason. Well, now let's talk about the Amari Cooper problem. Obviously, they signed him mid-season when, they were trying to find a way to bolster this wide receiver core, even though they were playing decently at the time. But ultimately, I do feel that Amari Cooper was a huge disappointment, and I wouldn't mind seeing him go. Although the Bills will try and keep him, they do want to really be aggressive in retaining a lot of the talent that they feel can help bolster their squad. So I would expect talks between his representatives and the Bills to go amicably, but ultimately I would not have an issue with them cutting ties with Cooper, potentially looking at someone in the draft to draft, because over the past couple of years they've had really woeful luck in terms of drafting wide receivers, letting a guy like Xavier Worthy go to the Kansas City Chiefs in last year's draft class as a prime example of their foibles in that regard. But I do think that we'll get to the draft in a couple minutes, but ultimately I think that in terms of addressing your offense, that could be a potential route for the Bills to go. I know it's not necessarily the route they feel most comfortable with, even though Keon Coleman is someone who I think could be a fascinating project. They do love going out and being aggressive in terms of signing free agent wide receivers. It's the reason why they got a guy like Stephon Diggs. I ultimately feel like building a younger core could mean more growth and development and thus maturity in this wide receiver core for the next couple of years. But looking ahead to this draft for Buffalo, I feel like there are a lot more defensive players who could immediately be plug-and-play starters for you that will also bolster positions in areas of need than offensive ones. Because I feel like this wide receiver class, after a certain point, you're really throwing darts at a board. But I do feel like in terms of, say, ends, tackles, maybe even linebackers, but especially corners and safeties, where the Bills are picking, are very, very rich in nature. And so I do feel like Buffalo should be thinking either defensive end to really help bolster that front seven, because I do like Ed Oliver and Eji Espinosa, but they're not necessarily the big stars you need to dominate up front week in, week out consistently. But I'm looking corner here for the Bills, because I do think that it's a tough system to play zone coverage, but I do feel like it's very rewarding if you can find the right guy. And they did allow 5.5 yards per play this season, which was very middling for a unit that expects to be tops in the league. So I'm looking at a guy like Siobhan Revelle, who's going to be questioned very often in this draft cycle because of his injury history, but I do believe he has the length, the ball skills, the versatility, and most importantly, the toughness required to be a Buffalo Bill. Because when I think about all the things that I love about Buffalo, it's that physicality, it's that toughness. And I feel like the defining moments of that loss came down to the Kansas City Chiefs just ultimately winning the toughness battle. So if you draft more players, think like the Chiefs perhaps, in terms of drafting tough physical players, you can develop them into superstars, and eventually they can buy into the Buffalo system, which I really like. But you need players who you feel are superstars, not just projects from here on out if you're Buffalo. Because that's what I feel like Buffalo's starting to become, a little bit project-y, a little bit too developmental in certain aspects. I want them to be more aggressive in diagnosing certain problems and attacking them at the point. Because if they're too tentative, this offseason, chances are a team like Kansas City is going to come along and notice that. You're letting your guard down. Why don't we be aggressive in this situation and we only make ourselves stronger as a result? So I want to see Buffalo be the aggressor, but ultimately, because of all these free agency questions and situations to figure out, it might be a little bit interesting to see how Buffalo looks come next season. Let me know what you think about this Buffalo team and how it will play in for the offseason in the comments below. Because coming up next, we take a look at another AFC playoff participant in the Baltimore Ravens. What do they need to do to finally get over the hump? And what does Lamar need in order for him to make sure that he's not going down in history as one of the weirder 3-time, potentially, MVP winners in recent memory? We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?